The social discount rate. According to a social discount rate, the present moral importance of future events, especially benefits and losses, declines at a rate of n% per year. Two commonly employed rates are 5% and 10%. With one kind of SDR, I have no quarrel. This is an SDR applied to benefits and losses measured in monetary terms, on the assumption that there will be inflation. But many economists apply an SDR to benefits and losses measured at the size that they will have when they occur. My example in the text is not imagined. It has been seriously suggested that in assessing the risks of the disposal of nuclear wastes, we should apply a social discount rate to future deaths. More generally, social discount rates have been applied not to monetary gains and losses, but to what economists call the actual utility that will be enjoyed by future people. This is the kind of SDR that I discuss. Why has this kind of SDR been thought to be justified? I am aware of 6 arguments. The argument from democracy. Many people care less about the further future. Some writers claim that if this is true of most of the adult citizens of some democratic country, this country's government ought to employ a social discount rate. If its electorate does care less about the further future, a democratic government ought to do so. Failure to do so would be paternalistic or authoritarian. In one writer's words, the government's decisions should reflect only the preferences of present individuals. We can ignore this argument since there are 2 questions. 1. As a community, may we use a social discount rate? Are we morally justified in being less concerned about the more remote effects of our social policies at some rate of n% per year? 2. If most of our community answer yes to question 1, ought our government to override this majority view? The argument from democracy applies only to question 2. To question 1, which is our concern, the argument is irrelevant. The point might be put like this. A Democrat believes in certain constitutional arrangements. These provide his answer to question 2. How could his commitment to democracy give him an answer to question 1? Only if he assumes that what the majority want or believe to be right must be right. But no sensible Democrat assumes this. Suppose that some majority want to wage an aggressive war, caring nothing about the slaughter of innocent aliens. This would not show that they are right not to care. In the same way, even if most of us do care less about the more remote effects of our social policies, and believe such lesser concern to be morally justified, this cannot show that it is justified. Whatever most of us want or believe, this moral question remains open. It may be objected, in some cases this is not a moral question. Suppose that, in some referendum, we vote for a social policy that will affect only ourselves. And suppose that, because we care less about what will happen to us later, we vote for a policy that will bring us benefits now at the cost of greater burdens later. This policy is against our interests. But since this policy will affect only ourselves, we cannot be acting wrongly in voting for this policy. We can at most be acting irrationally. on the assumptions that most of us accept, these claims do provide some defense of the social discount rate. But this defense seldom applies. Most social policies will affect our children as well as ourselves. If we vote for a policy that will be against the interests of our children, most of us would admit that this would be, to some degree, morally wrong. Similar remarks apply to the interests of those people who are not yet born. It is a moral question how much weight we ought to give to the interests of these people. Another objection is that votes are seldom unanimous. If some policy will be against our interests, it will likely to be against the interests of the minority who voted against it. The majority who voted in favor would then be acting against the interests of this minority. This is another ground for moral criticism. As these remarks show, there would be few cases in which the social discount rate does not raise a moral question. If one of my earlier claims is justified, there would be no such cases. I argued that if we care less about what will happen to us later and therefore act against our own interests, this may not be irrational, but such questions are open to criticism. I claim that acts against our interests in this way should be regarded as morally wrong. If this is so, the social discount rate would always raise a moral question. The argument from probability. It is often claimed that we should discount more remote effects because they are less likely to occur. There are again two questions here. 1. When a prediction applies to the further future, is it less likely to be correct? 2. If some prediction is correct, may we give it less weight because it applies to the further future? The answer to 1 is often yes. But this provides no argument for answering yes to 2. Suppose we are deciding whether to cease or increase our use of nuclear energy. We are considering possible accidents with estimates of predicted deaths from escaped radiation. In a small accident, such deaths might all remain statistical in the sense that we would never know which particular deaths this accident had caused. When considering possible accidents, we must think far into the future, since some radioactive elements remain dangerous for thousands of years. According to a social discount rate of 5%, one statistical death next year counts for more than 1 billion deaths in 400 years. Compared with causing the single death, it is morally less important whether our chosen policy causes the billion deaths. This conclusion is outrageous. The billion people would be killed further in the future, but this cannot justify the claim that, compared with killing the single person, we would be acting less badly if we instead killed 1 billion people. The argument from probability does not lead to this conclusion. It could at most lead to a different conclusion. We know that if radiation escapes next year, we will have no adequate defense. We may believe that over the next 4 centuries, some kind of countermeasure will be invented, or some cure. We may thus believe that if radiation escapes in 400 years, it will then be much less likely to cause deaths. If we are very optimistic, we may think this 1 billion times less likely. This would be a different reason for discounting by a factor of 1 billion deaths in 400 years. We would not be making the outrageous claim that if we do cause such deaths, each of these deaths will matter morally 1 billion times less than a single death next year. We would instead be claiming that these more remote deaths are less likely to be caused. This would be why, in our view, we need hardly be concerned about the escape of radiation in 400 years. If we were right to claim that such deaths are 1 billion times less likely, our conclusion would be justified. Deaths that do not occur, whether now or in 400 years, do not matter. This example illustrates a general point. We ought to discount those predictions that are more likely to be false. Call this a probabilistic discount rate. Predictions about the further future are more likely to be false. So the two kinds of discount rate, temporal and probabilistic, roughly correlate. But they are quite different. It is therefore a mistake to discount for time rather than for probability. One objection is that this misstates our moral view. It makes us claim not that more remote bad consequences are less likely, but that they are less important. This is not our real view. A greater objection is that the two discount rates do not always coincide. Predictions about the further future are not less likely to be true at some rate of n% per year. When applied to the further future, many predictions are indeed more likely to be true. If we discount for time rather than probability, we may thus be led to what, even on our own assumptions, are the wrong conclusions. The argument from opportunity cost. It is sometimes better to receive a benefit earlier, since this benefit can then be used to produce further benefits. If an investment yields a return next year, this will be worth more than the same return after 10 years. If the earlier return can be reinvested profitably over these 10 years. When we have added in the extra benefits from this reinvestment, the total sum of benefits will be greater. A similar argument covers certain kinds of cost. The delaying of some benefits thus involves opportunity costs, and vice versa. This is sometimes thought to justify a social discount rate, but the justification fails, and for the same two reasons. Certain opportunity costs do increase over time, but if we discount for time, rather than simply adding in these extra costs, we will misrepresent our moral reasoning. More important, we can be led astray. Consider those benefits that are not reinvested but consumed. When such benefits are received later, this may involve no opportunity costs. Suppose we are deciding whether to build some airport. This would destroy some stretch of beautiful countryside. We would lose the benefit of enjoying this natural beauty. If we do not build the proposed airport, we and our successors would enjoy this benefit in every future year. According to a social discount rate, the benefits in later years count for much less than the benefit next year. How could an appeal to opportunity costs justify this? The benefit received next year, our enjoyment of this natural beauty, cannot be profitably reinvested. Nor can the argument apply to those costs which are merely consumed. Suppose we know that if we adopt some policy, there will be some risk of causing genetic deformities. The argument cannot show that a genetic deformity next year ought to count for 10 times as much as a deformity in 20 years. The most that could be claimed is this: we might decide that for each child so affected, the large sum of K dollars would provide adequate compensation. If we were going to provide such compensation, the present cost of ensuring this would be much greater for a deformity caused next year. We would now have to set aside almost the full K dollars. A mere tenth of this sum, if set aside now and profitably invested, might yield in 20 years what would then be equivalent to K dollars. This provides one reason for being less concerned now about the deformities we might cause in the further future. But the reason is not that such deformities matter less. The reason is that it would now cost us only a tenth as much to ensure that, when such deformities occur, we would be able to provide compensation. This is a crucial difference. Suppose we know that we will not in fact provide compensation. This might be so, for instance, if we would not be able to identify those particular genetic deformities that our policy had caused. This removes our reason for being less concerned now about deformities in later years. If we will not pay compensation for such deformities, it becomes an irrelevant fact that, in the case of later deformities, it would have been cheaper to ensure now that we could have paid compensation. But if this fact has led us to adopt a social discount rate, we may fail to notice when it becomes irrelevant. We may be led to assume that, even when there is no compensation, deformities in 20 years matter only a tenth as much as deformities next year. Here is another objection to the argument. In certain periods, investments bring no return. When this is true, the argument from opportunity costs fails to apply. The social discount rate again fails to correlate with anything that matters. These brief remarks overlook many of the issues. Of the various arguments for a social discount rate, the appeal to opportunity costs is the hardest to assess. But the central question is, I believe, simple. It may be, in several ways, more convenient or elegant to calculate opportunity costs using a social discount rate. But the conclusions that are established by such calculations could be re-expressed in a temporally neutral way. When describing the effects of future policies, economists could state what future benefits and costs there would be at different times in a way that used no discount rate. The arguments that appeal to opportunity costs could be fully stated in these terms. I believe that on any important question that we need to decide, this would be a better, because less misleading, description of the alternatives. It will make it easier to reach the right decision. The argument that our successors will be better off. If we assume that our successors will be better off than we are now, there are two plausible arguments for discounting the benefits and costs that we give to and impose on them. If we measure the benefits and costs in monetary terms, adjusted for future inflation, we can appeal to the diminishing marginal utility of money. The same increase in wealth generally brings a smaller benefit to those who are better off. We may also appeal to a distributive principle. An equally great benefit given to those who are better off may be claimed to be morally less important. These two arguments, though good, do not justify a social discount rate. The ground for discounting these future benefits is not that they come further in the future, but that they will come to people who are better off. Here, as elsewhere, we should say what we mean, and the correlation is again imperfect. Some of our successors may not be better off than we are now. If they are not, the arguments just given fail to apply. The argument from excessive sacrifice. A typical statement runs, we clearly need a discount rate for theoretical reasons. Otherwise, any small increase in benefits that extends far into the future might demand any amount of sacrifice in the present, because in time the benefits would outweigh the cost. The same objections apply. If this is why we adopt a social discount rate, we shall be misstating what we believe. Our belief is not that the importance of future benefits steadily declines. It is rather that no generation can be morally required to make more than certain kinds of sacrifice for the sake of future generations. If this is what we believe, this is what should influence our decisions. We may have another belief. If we aimed for the greatest net sum of benefits over time, this might require a very unequal distribution between different generations. Utilitarians would claim that, given realistic assumptions, this would not be true. But suppose that it is true. We may then wish to avoid the conclusion that there ought to be such an unequal distribution. And we can avoid this conclusion in some cases if we discount later benefits. But, as Rawls points out, this is the wrong way to avoid this conclusion. If we do not believe that there ought to be such inequality, we should not simply aim for the greatest net sum of benefits. We should have a second moral aim, that the benefits are fairly shared between different generations. To our principle of utility, we should add a principle about fair distribution. This more accurately states our real view, and it removes our reason for discounting later benefits. If instead we express our view by adopting a social discount rate, we can be led needlessly to implausible conclusions. Suppose that at the same cost to ourselves now, we could prevent either a minor catastrophe in the nearer future or a major catastrophe in the further future. Since preventing the major catastrophe would involve no extra cost, the argument from excessive sacrifice fails to apply. But if we take the argument to justify a social discount rate, we shall be led to conclude that the greater catastrophe is less worth preventing. The argument from special relations. Some utilitarians claim that each person should be given equal weight to the interests of everyone. This is not what most of us believe. According to common sense morality, we ought to give some weight to the interests of strangers, but there are certain people to whom we either may or should give some kind of priority. Thus, we are morally permitted to give some kinds of priority to our own interests. Most of us believe that we have no duty to help others when this would require from us too great a sacrifice. And there are certain people to whose interests we ought to give some kinds of priority. These are the people to whom we stand in certain special relations. Thus, each person ought to give some kinds of priority to the interests of his children, parents, pupils, patients, those whom he represents, or his fellow citizens. Such a view naturally applies to the effects of our acts on future generations. Our immediate successors will be our own children. According to common sense, we ought to give to their welfare special weight. We may think the same, though to a reduced degree, about our children's children. Similar claims seem plausible at the community level. We believe that our government ought to be especially concerned about the interests of its own citizens. It would be natural to claim that it ought to be especially concerned about the future children of its citizens, and, to a lesser degree, about their grandchildren. Such claims might support a new kind of discount rate. We would be discounting here not for time itself, but for degrees of kinship. But at least these two relations cannot radically converge or diverge. Our grandchildren cannot all be born before all our children. Since the correlation is here more secure, we might be tempted to employ a standard discount rate. I believe that here too, this would be unjustified. For one thing, on any discount rate, more remote effects always count for less. But a discount rate with respect to kinship should at some point cease to apply, or, to avoid discontinuity, asymptotically approach some horizontal level that is above zero. We ought to give some weight to the effects of our acts on mere strangers. We ought not to give less weight to effects on our own descendants. Nor should this discount rate apply to all kinds of effect. Consider this comparison. Perhaps the US government ought in general to give priority to the welfare of its own citizens. But this does not apply to the infliction of grave harms. Suppose this government decides to resume atmospheric nuclear tests. If it predicts that the resulting fallout would cause several deaths, should it discount the deaths of aliens? Should it therefore move these tests to the Indian Ocean? I believe that, in such a case, the special relations make no moral difference. We should take the same view about the harms that we impose on our remote successors. I have discussed 6 arguments for the social discount rate. None succeeds. The most that they could justify is the use of such a rate as a crude rule of thumb. But this rule would often go astray. It may often be morally permissible to be less concerned about the more remote effects of our social policies. But this would never be because these effects are more remote. Rather, it would be because they are less likely to occur, or would be effects on people who are better off than us, or because it would be cheaper now to ensure compensation, or it would be for one of the other reasons I've given. All these different reasons need to be stated and judged separately on their merits. If we bundle them together in a social discount rate, we make ourselves morally blind. Remoteness in time roughly correlates with a whole range of morally important facts. So does remoteness in space. Those to whom we have the greatest obligations, our own family, often live with us in the same building. We often live close to those to whom we have other special obligations, such as our clients, pupils, or patients. Most of our fellow citizens live closer to us than most aliens. But no one suggests that because there are such correlations, we should adopt a social discount rate. No one thinks that we would be morally justified if we cared less about the long-range effects of our acts at some rate of n% per yard. The temporal discount rate is, I believe, as little justified. When the other arguments do not apply, we ought to be equally concerned about the predictable effects of our acts, whether these will occur in 1 or 100 or 1,000 years. This has great importance. Some effects are predictable, even in the distant future. Nuclear wastes may be dangerous for thousands of years, and some of our acts have permanent effects. This would be so, for instance, of the destruction of a species, or of much of our environment, or of the irreplaceable parts of our cultural heritage.